every single day that go into a situation as complex as this one. The big strategic decisions, those are decided by the president. The tactical, operational decisions are made by different agencies, agency heads, agency officials.
Well, I'm more interested in the top decision making. Look, we've all seen this. We saw it as recently as yesterday. Somebody in the White House has authority to press the button and stop the president, cut off the president's speaking ability and sound. Who is that person?
I think anyone who knows the president, including members of this committee, knows that he speaks very clearly and very deliberately for himself. No one else does.
Well, are you saying that there is no one in the White House that can cut him off? Because yesterday that happened, and it's happened a number of times before that. It's been widely reported that somebody has the ability to push the button and cut off his sound and stop him from speaking. Who is that person?
There is no such person. Again, the president speaks for himself, makes all of the strategic decisions, informed by the best advice that he can get from the people around him.
So are you unaware that this is actually happening? Because it happened yesterday at the Interagency Fire Center. It was widely reported, the media's reported on it, and it's not the first time it's happened several times. Are you telling this committee that this does not happen, that there's no one in the White House who pushes the button and cuts him off in mid-sentence?
That's correct.
So this didn't happen yesterday, nor on the other occasions where the media showed the American people that his sentence was cut off in mid-sentence. Yeah. Are you saying that didn't happen?
Senator, I really don't know what you're referring to. All I can tell you is, having worked with the president for now 20 years, both here on this committee and over the last 9 months at the White House, the president very much speaks for himself.
Well, let's take a different attack. He does speak for himself, but what happens when somebody doesn't want him speaking? You're telling us you don't know anything about this, that somebody cuts him off in mid-sentence. Is that what you're trying to tell this committee? Because everybody here has seen it.
Senator, I'm telling you, based on my own experience with the president over the last 20 years, anyone who tried to stop him from saying what he wanted to say, speaking his mind, would probably not be long for their job.
Let's turn to the dissent cable that you received in July. Are you willing to give a copy of this dissent cable that you got from 24 diplomats regarding the imminent catastrophic collapse in Afghanistan? Are you willing to give a copy of that to this committee?
Senator, this dissent channel is something that I place tremendous value and importance on. It's a way for people in the State Department to speak the truth as they see it to power. And these cables, I've read every single one of the dissent channel cables that we've gotten during this administration. I've responded to every single one. I factored what I read and heard into my thinking and into my actions. But the legitimacy of the channel, the ability for people to be able to, with confidence, share their thoughts, share their views, even when they run counter to what their seniors have said or the policies being prescribed. It's vitally important that we protect that channel, protect its integrity, and it is designed by its very regulations only to be shared with senior officials in the department. And what I don't want to see is some kind of chilling effect going forward that says to those who would think of writing a cable in the future that this will get out widely, be distributed in ways that would have that chilling effect.
Do you admit that you received a dissent cable in July signed by 24 diplomats that warned about the imminent catastrophic collapse that was coming in Afghanistan?
Senator, I certainly received the cable in mid-July. I read it. I responded to it. I factored its contents into my thinking. And what the cable said broadly was two things. It did not suggest that the government and security forces were going to collapse prior to our departure. it did express real concerns about the durability of that government and force after our departure, and it focused on the efforts that we were making, particularly on the SIV front, to try to expedite moving them out. And in fact, a number of the recommendations, the very good recommendations it made, were already in train. Others were not, but one of the ones that was in train was the establishment of Operation Allies Refuge. We received the cable on July 13th. That operation was actually put into force on July 14th. It had already been planned for some time, and this was an effort to expedite the identification and relocation of SIVs, actually putting them on planes, which, as you know, is not part of the program, actually relocating them and working to establish transit sites so that we could put them there while we finished processing them.
Well, you see, that's the problem with us not having access to that cable. You're telling us that, but we have been told by others that it was significantly different than what you're saying. Also, we really would like to see the response to that, because I think history is going to be interested in that particular cable and your response to it. I'll save my next question for the next round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cardin, I've asked Senator Cardin to, in addition to his questions, preside for a few minutes since I have a hearing that I have to just go to. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you during the Afghan evacuations for almost the daily briefings you had for all members of the United States Senate and keeping us totally informed as to the events unfolding. I contrast that to what happened during the Trump years, where we were not kept informed at all about the negotiations between the Trump administration and the Taliban, that we had no briefings or information at all in regards to the summit meetings between the United States and North Korea, or the United States and Russia, where our committee could not conduct the oversight that is so important, as you have pointed out, working with the executive branch in a check and balance for the unity of our country. So I thank you very much for the way that you have kept us engaged and informed as decisions have been made. As you pointed out, the Biden administration was dealt a very difficult hand on the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We all recognized we needed to withdraw. The options were extremely limited. The mistakes made by previous administrations, we've talked about it, but I think we need to understand that many of us did not support the 2002 campaign to go into Iraq. And one of those reasons was that we wanted to complete the mission in Afghanistan when we had a chance to do it when the Taliban was diminished after our military came in after the attack on our country. But instead, we went into Iraq, which was not engaged in the 9/11 activities, and we never finished Afghanistan, a mistake made by the Bush administration. Now, we've already talked about the Trump administration and setting a deadline and releasing prisoners and moving forward with the reduction of troops when there was really very little options that the administration had. It doesn't negate the information that was made available to you about the strength of the Afghan security forces and the Ghani administration's will to stick with it in Afghanistan. And I think many of us are interested in knowing how intelligence got that so wrong. And the contingency plans are ones that we really do want to review, because it seems to us there had to be better ways to secure passage into the airport than what ultimately happened. But considering the hand that you were dealt, considering the crisis that developed, evacuating 124,000 was a miraculous task. So we congratulate all that were involved in the evacuation of so many people under such a short period of time, under such difficult circumstances. I want to get to where we are today. During this process, the State Department was very open to all members of Congress, Democrats, Republicans, as we filtered information into you about vulnerable people in an effort to get them out of Afghanistan. Today, our offices are still being deluged by requests to help people that are in Afghanistan. NGOs are working very aggressively. Can you share with us the process that you're using in order to filter information about Americans that are still in Afghanistan who want to leave, those that applied for SIV status, and those Afghans that are at risk. How do we transmit that information, and what process is in place so that we can try to get these people out of Afghanistan?
Yes, thank you, Senator. As I noted, we've established a task force focused entirely on relocation to help those who wish to leave Afghanistan, whether they're any remaining American citizens, whether it's SIV applicants, whether it's Afghans at risk, whether it's the nationals of partner countries, get out. And that involves a number of things. It involves, for the American citizens, case management teams, 500 individuals whose task is to be in constant contact with any remaining American citizens who wish to leave, and that's what they're doing. It also includes, together with our Legislative Affairs Office, being in constant contact with you, as well as with outside groups who have identified and are trying to help people who seek to leave. This here is the sum total of cases brought to us by members of this committee, just this committee, that all of you, or many of you, have been working, and we are deeply grateful for those efforts, for this information. It ensures that when you send us the information, we put it into our database, if it's not already there. We make sure that we're able to track it. We make sure we're able to coordinate with you. And I recognize that especially in the early going, during the evacuation itself, some of the feedback was lacking. We were trying to do all of this in real time, making sure that we took in the information that you were providing and acting on it. And in some cases, we didn't get back to people to say, here's what we've done. And we've been working to make sure that we get back to everyone. I think we had 26,000 inquiries from Congress. We've responded to 21 or 22,000 of them.
So you still have the categories of reporters that work for us that are still in Afghanistan. We have women officials that were officials in Afghanistan that are at risk. We have NGOs that worked with us in Afghanistan, their employees that are at risk. So you're saying we still have an opportunity to work with you to get that information to the sources that you're using to try to arrange for their exit from Afghanistan?
Yes, absolutely, and we very much invite that, and we want to make sure that we have as best possible a unified, coordinated list so that we know what everyone is working on, and we can track and we can help or we can take on depending on the.
And can I get your best guess on the numbers? At one point when we first started, we thought there might be somewhere around a little less than 100,000 of U.S. citizens, SIVs, and Afghans at risk that wanted to leave. Obviously, that number was low. We've already evacuated over 124,000. Do we know how many U.S. citizens are in Afghanistan that want to exit today? How many are in SIV status that want to exit? And how many Afghans at risk we want to help?
On the American citizens who wish to leave, the number is about 100. And it's very hard to give a real-time number at any given moment because it's very fluid, by which I mean this. Some people, and we're in direct contact with this group. Some, for very understandable reasons, are changing their mind from day to day about whether or not they want to leave. Others continue, even now, to raise their hands and say, I'm an American citizen in Afghanistan, someone who had not identified themselves before. And again, I think as all of you know very, very well, we do not require as a country our citizens to register or identify themselves to our embassies in any country in the world when they travel there or if they reside there.
And do you have the numbers for SIV and for?
So the SIV numbers, that we're tabulating right now because we're trying to account for everyone who has come in. Some people remain in transit countries. Other people are now in the United States. We're putting all of those numbers together to determine the overwhelming majority of Afghans who have come out of Afghanistan thanks to our evacuation efforts are in one way or another Afghans at risk. Some will be SIV applicants, others will be P1 or P2 applicants, others will be in none of those categories but Afghans at risk. We're breaking down all of those numbers, and we should have a breakdown for you in the next couple of weeks.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing that. Senator Rubio?
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, in your statement, I think that the most troubling thing is the following quote from you. Even the most pessimistic assessment did not predict the government forces in Kabul would collapse while U.S. forces remained. I back that up by saying you also cite General Milley, who said there was no indication that there would be a rapid collapse of the Afghan army and government. For much of last year, I was the acting chairman of intelligence. I'm now the vice chairman of intelligence. I've been tracking this very, very closely. And just going back to the beginning of this year, obviously I can't quote the titles of the pieces, but let me suffice it to say that there are numerous pieces that would be categorized as it's going to hit the fan. And but let's just for a moment put that aside, okay? Because I think any analysis of those pieces would have led anyone to that conclusion. Putting that aside for a moment, we had every reason to believe and to plan for the rapid collapse of the Afghan military and the Afghan government. At the beginning of 2020, by all admissions, we had already really bad status quo in Afghanistan. Okay, we had a small footprint, but we had a strong commitment to air support, and that sustained the Afghan security forces' ability to resist the Taliban. The security forces of Afghanistan were suffering 10,000 casualties a year. The Taliban was suffering casualties too, but they enjoyed safe haven in Pakistan. They were able to go there to rest, to refit, to train, to recruit. And so in summary, even before the withdrawal, we had a terrible status quo. The security forces, a small number of U.S. forces, continued to die. We had U.S. losses as well, I want to mention that, but the Afghan government was still fractious and corrupt, and the Taliban had an unchallenged safe haven in Pakistan. Or put another way, and paraphrasing your own words from your opening statement, if after 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars in support, equipment, and training, there's not enough for the Afghan government or the Afghan security forces to become more resilient or self-sustaining, what did we think was going to happen as that support began to be removed? What did we think was going to happen when that terrible status quo was changed? It doesn't take some exquisite piece of intelligence or some brilliant analysis to conclude that if you radically change an already bad status quo, by removing U.S. and NATO forces, by ending enablers and air support, the status quo was going to collapse in favor of the Taliban. This is not an argument in favor of staying. I think that ship has sailed, okay? Because I know a lot of time has been spent on justifying the withdrawal. We're not debating the withdrawal. What I'm arguing is we had a terrible status quo as is. By your own admission, the Afghan government, even after billions of dollars in 20 years, was not self-sustaining, was not resilient. We should have known that as we began to draw down support, we were going to see the potential for a collapse. And that's what all these pieces pointed to as well. So it's concerning that no one saw all of this and concluded that there was no evidence or no reason to believe that there could be a rapid collapse. More to that point, we began to see clear signs weeks ago that this is where it was headed. Without airstrikes, the Taliban now began to mass and maneuver, going from intimidating these small Afghan outposts to actually getting them into quitting. We were seeing Afghan outposts begin to quit. The Taliban they went from surrounding these small provincial capitals to surrounding major cities with 5,000 to 8,000 Taliban fighters. This is weeks before. By the way, this is at the same time as I believe on July 8th, President Biden was still giving this naive, optimistic prediction about the fighting capabilities of the Afghan forces and so forth. We could see them meticulously focused on the north. You could see that they were methodically and carefully splintering the sclerotic remains of any sort of resistance. Weeks before the fall of Kabul, you could see the Taliban was on the verge, was headed towards doing something they hadn't done before. They were going to isolate Kabul from the north, cutting off all their supply routes. So we knew weeks before that we were headed for a Taliban control of the north. All the traditional routes of Taliban encroachment on Kabul were nearly sealed, the south and the east. Kabul faced the prospect of no fuel. The Afghan government faced the prospect of being unable to mount any viable opposition and sustain defense. What did we think was going to happen? All of those things were in place at the time. And I think the most concerning part of it is that if we didn't have an analysis that looked at all this, this wasn't a failure of intelligence. This was a failure of policy and planning. We have the wrong people analyzing this. Someone didn't see this. Either someone didn't see this or someone didn't want to see this, because we had established this, we wanted to be out by September 11th so that we could have some ceremony arguing that we got and pulled out of Afghanistan on the anniversary of 9/11. The fact of the matter is, where it leaves us now, on top of all the other things that have been mentioned here from a geopolitical perspective, is not a good place. I think China and Russia and Iran, they look at this botched withdrawal, and what they see is incompetence that they think they might be able to exploit, may lead to miscalculation. I think the Europeans, our allies, who had very little say, if any, or control certainly over the timing and the execution of all this, they're now, number one, have to be wondering about our reliability, the credibility of our defense agreements with them, but they also have to be really, really upset at the prospects of a massive refugee crisis landing right on their borders here very soon. And India, and I know that there was an announcement today, there'll be a meeting of the Quad fairly soon, which is a good development, except that in the Pacific region, if you're India, you're looking at this and saying, if the United States allowed Pakistan to unravel their standing, because the Pakistani role in all this, and I think multiple administrations are guilty of ignoring it, the Pakistani role in enabling the Taliban is ultimately a victory for those pro-Taliban hardliners in the Pakistani government. They have to be looking at this and saying, if the United States could have, a third-rate power like Pakistan unravel its aims, what chance do they have of confronting China? So I think this leaves us in a terrible situation, but I go back to the initial point. I don't know how it's possible. If in fact, the people in charge of our foreign policy did not see all of these factors and conclude that there was a very real possibility of a very rapid collapse, then we've got the wrong people making military and diplomacy decisions in our government.
Senator, I'm happy to respond briefly in the time that we have. As you know from your own expertise and leadership on these matters, there are constant assessments being done, and in this particular case, assessments being done of the resilience of Afghan security forces, of the Afghan government, and different scenarios established, from worst case to best case to everything in between. And ultimately, the preponderance of the intelligence and assessments land someplace, and there are always going to be voices, and critically important that we listen to all of them, who may be talking about exclusively the worst case, some best case, some in between. Here's what I can say in this setting, and we can take this up as well in other settings. Back in February, the assessment of the overall assessment of the community was that after a complete U.S. military withdrawal, that could potentially, in the worst case scenario, lead to the Taliban capturing Kabul within a year or two. So that's back in February, and that was more or less where things stood in the winter and into the spring. By July, and you're exactly right, that the situation was deteriorating as the Taliban continued to make progress on the ground throughout the summer. In July, the IC indicated that it was more likely than not that the Taliban would take over by the end of the year, the end of this year. That said, we, the intelligence community, did not say that the countrywide collapse of all meaningful resistance would be likely to occur in a matter of days. And you referenced Chairman Milley, as I did earlier. Nothing that he saw, that I saw, that we saw suggested that this government and security force would collapse in a matter of 11 days. And you're right that I think we need to look back at all of this because, to your point, we collectively, over 20 years, invested extraordinary amounts in those security forces and in that government. Hundreds of billions of dollars, equipment, training, advice, support. And based on that, as well as based on what we were looking at real time, again, we did not see this collapse in a matter of 11 days. But I think it is important that we go back and look at all of this.
The time has expired.
Thank you.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for appearing before the committee today. I appreciate and share the frustration of my colleagues over the challenges with the evacuation, over the situation of special immigrant visa applicants and the Taliban's treatment of women and girls and other minorities. But I also agree with your assessment and that's been given by several others, that where we were when we got to that evacuation was because of the failure of both Democratic and Republican administrations. And I want to know where that outrage was when year after year, for 10 years, starting with Senator McCain, I and others in the Senate tried to get more special immigrant visa applicants through the process so that they could leave Afghanistan, leave the threat, and come to the United States. And there were a few Republicans in the Senate who blocked us year after year from getting more SIV applicants to the United States. And I want to know where that outrage was during the negotiations by the Trump administration and former Secretary Pompeo, when they were giving away the rights of women and girls, and when Secretary Pompeo came before this committee and blew off questions about what they were doing to pressure the Taliban to have women at the negotiating table for that peace treaty. So I think there is a lot of regret and a lot of recriminations to go around. And the important thing for us to do now is to figure out how we can work together to address those people who still need to be evacuated from Afghanistan, and also to ensure that we can do everything possible with the international community to help protect the human rights of the women and girls who remain in the country and those minorities. So, Mr. Secretary, that's where I'm going to put my effort. I do think we need an accounting. That's important for history and for us going forward. But let's stop with the hypocrisy about who's to blame. There are a lot of people to blame, and we all share in it. Now, Mr. Secretary, as you know, I was one of those who was opposed to our withdrawing from Afghanistan. I'm not going to revisit that, but a lot of my concerns were around the rights of women and girls if Afghanistan fell into the hands of the Taliban. So I want to ask you now, and you've been very specific on briefing calls that you share the concern, and I recognize that you believe it's a priority for this administration to do what you can to protect the rights of women and girls. So can you talk specifically about what steps the department is taking to provide for the safety of women and girls and how we're trying to rally the international community behind that effort?
Yes, thank you, Senator. And let me just start by thanking you personally for your leadership for a long time now on these issues, both on the SIVs and the work that we've actually been able to do to try to improve the program, but more work needs to be done, as well, of course, as on women and girls. From advancing women, peace, and security and that agenda to ensuring that there's an equal playing field for women and girls, you've made a huge difference. And I have to say, over the last 20 years, we have made a difference collectively in Afghanistan. And possibly the biggest difference we made was for women and girls. Access to education, access to health care, access to work, and opportunity. All of that was as a result of many of the efforts that we made and that this Congress made and supported, including with very, very significant assistance. This is hard. I was in Kabul after the president announced his decision. I met with women leaders from the then parliament, NGOs, a lawyer, human rights defenders, listened and heard from them about their concerns about the future. Just the past couple of weeks when I was out in Doha and then in Ramstein, I talked to young women and girls who we'd evacuated and heard from them both of their gratitude for having been evacuated, but also their deep concerns, more than deep concerns, about the future for the women and girls who remain in Afghanistan. So, with that very much in mind, we have done a few things, and this is where we really want to work closely with you and with every member. One, we've worked to rally the international community to set very clear expectations of the Taliban going forward, to include the expectation that it will uphold the basic rights of women and girls as well as minorities. And that's visible in the statement that more than 100 countries have signed at our initiative. It's also in a UN Security Council resolution that we initiated and got passed. And I know people say, oh, it's a statement or a Security Council resolution, it doesn't matter. Well, in the case of the Security Council resolution, just to cite one example, there are significant sanctions that from the United Nations on the Taliban. There are travel restrictions on the Taliban. And the idea that if the Taliban is in violation of the Security Council resolution that we established, it will get any relief just on that alone, the UN sanctions or travel restrictions, I think that's pretty clear that won't happen. That's just one point of leverage. We've been working to make sure that the international community speaks with one voice and acts together, including on this. That's one. Second, we want to make sure that assistance continues to flow. Humanitarian assistance, including assistance that's directed at the special needs of women and girls. We're doing that consistent with our sanctions, and we're able to do that by working through NGOs and the UN agencies. Now, I don't want to sugarcoat this because we know that while the Taliban seeks and will probably support and protect basic humanitarian assistance through these agencies, like for food and medicine, it may be a different story when it comes to things that are directed specifically at women and girls. So we're going to be very focused on that and trying to make sure that that assistance can go through, that it's monitored effectively, including by the agencies doing it. And I have spent some time talking with the head of the United Nations effort on this in terms of having a clear monitoring mechanism for this and to carry that forward. Next, we will soon appoint, at my direction, a senior official responsible for focusing and marshaling all of our efforts on support for women, girls, and minorities in Afghanistan. I think it's very important that we have a focal point in the U.S. government, at the State Department, whose responsibility is to carry forward this agenda, working closely with you in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I'm out of time, but can you share with us who that official is as soon as they're appointed?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, if I were just to read your testimony, not having watched any news, I would literally think this was a smashing success. But I do read the news, as most Americans do, and we realize this was a complete debacle. And I think what concerns me the most, among many things, is that detachment from reality. It's the same denial of reality, for example, on the border. A self-inflicted wound, a crisis created by President Biden's policies that have completely thrown open our borders, and yet the administration denies that we have a problem at the border. So I've got a number of questions. First of all, approximately what is the dollar value of the equipment that's been left behind that now the Taliban controls? What's the dollar value of that?
Senator, I believe the equipment provided over the last a little less than 20 years, 15 years, was about $80 billion. Of that equipment that remains, as you know, it was given some handed over to the Afghan security forces. And of course, some of that is now in the hands of the Taliban.
So I was also struck by your comment that in your testimony that even the most pessimistic assessment didn't predict the government would collapse as quickly as it did. But you just in your testimony said that the realistic predictions before the complete withdrawal was that it was going to collapse by the end of this year. So the administration continued with their plans of withdrawal, of evacuation, of surrender, knowing that the Taliban would be in control of $80 billion worth of sophisticated equipment at the end of that, correct? I mean, did that discussion ever come up in terms of maybe that wouldn't be a good idea, leaving all that equipment behind as we bug out of Afghanistan?
That assessment came in July. Much of the equipment, and again, I'll defer to my colleagues at the Pentagon who are more expert in this than I am. Much of that equipment was made inoperable. Other pieces of equipment will become inoperable because there is no ability on the part of the Taliban to maintain it. None of it, to the best of my knowledge, poses a strategic threat to us or to any of Afghanistan's neighbors. What we're looking at are primarily uniformed.
So we have an oversight letter. We'd like response on that. Let's just quick talk about the decision to close down Bagram. I mean, again, the president says this was, unanimously decided by the military. But isn't it true that the president decided what the troop level would be? A very minimal troop level. The president decided that we would keep the embassy open and it had to be protected. He forced the military's hands, right? In the end, it was his decision. It wasn't the military's decision to close Bagram.
The president makes the strategic decisions when it comes to the actual drawdown, the retrograde, to use the technical language. Those were decisions made by his military commanders. He sought their best advice, and that's what was carried out, including the timing of the decision to
another troubling piece of your testimony. You said when the president announced the withdrawal, NATO immediately unanimously embraced it. Joseph Borrell, the foreign affairs chief of the European Union, his statement on the surrender is that it's, quote, a catastrophe for the Afghan people, for Western values and credibility, and for the developing of international relations. The Wall Street Journal summarizes it quite nicely in their piece, just the title, How Biden Broke NATO. The chaotic Afghan withdrawal has shocked and angered U.S. allies. Again, that's detachment from reality that our NATO allies are on board with this thing. They're not. That's not what we're hearing.
Senator, I went to NATO well before the president's decision, along with Secretary of Defense Austin, and spent the day with all of our NATO allies, listening to them, their views, their prescriptions, their ideas for what we should do moving forward in Afghanistan. I shared some of our initial thinking at that point. We factored in everything we heard from our allies into our own decision-making process. When the president
just like you planned for every contingency. Okay, I got it.
If I could just continue.
But now, listen, it's bureaucratic speak. I have some questions. So, again, my concern is the detachment from reality. So, as we surrendered, as we're evacuating, as we're bugging out, we're hearing all these soothing comments from the administration. This is, almost like a well-oiled machine here. We've got, flights just leaving and 124,000 people being evacuated. We heard something completely different. So tell me what is wrong about what I had heard. First of all, prior to the Taliban providing perimeter security, there was no security, and basically tens of thousands of Afghanis flooded into the Kabul airport, correct?
There was perimeter security around the airport established.
But we literally had tens of thousands of people. We did not know who these people were. It wasn't like people we invited in that were special immigrant visa holders, correct?
We did not control the city. We controlled the airport. Sorry if you.
But again, so we had tens of thousands of people in Kabul airport. The reports we were getting on the ground is many had no form of ID whatsoever. When I went to Fort McCoy, I asked the commanding general. Again, every contingency planned for. I asked the commanding general, when did you first find out that your mission would be as an intake facility for the Afghanistan refugees? He said 10 days ago. I asked the commanding general, I asked the representative from the Department of State, as well as from the Department of Homeland Security, do we know that every refugee that you've received so far, and there's only 1,000 at that point in time, do we know that they at least have some form of ID? And we didn't. We're hearing all these assurances that we're getting biometrically screened, a 14-step plan. I asked the head of Northern Command, he's at Fort McCoy, describe those steps to me. What do we screen them against? I mean, are ISIS terrorists, are Al-Qaeda terrorists, have we biometrically screened them in the past so that we can compare them to a database? What is that 14-step process in detail? Not just 14 steps. Tell me, describe to us in detail, how are we keeping this nation safe from such a chaotic situation?
So, Senator, the 14-step process refers specifically to the special immigrant visa applicants, and there is a lengthy process.
So how about for the other 124,000 people?
So yes, so to come to your point, Senator, a couple of things. We arranged, as you know, transit countries so that any Afghan coming out of Afghanistan would initially go to a transit country where we could initiate the screening, the vetting, the background checks. We surged Customs and Border Protection officials to those transit points, as well, of course, as other security law enforcement agencies to do these checks with biometric, biographic, other information that we have. Then, as people are cleared in these transit points, they then come into the United States, but they're not being resettled immediately. They are going, once they land at Dulles or in Philadelphia, they are then being sent to military bases where the checks continue and are completed.
But again, what checks? We need specifically what the checks are going to be.
The senator has expired. I'm sure you can follow up for the rest of your questions. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, for this hearing, and thank you, Secretary Blinken, for your service and your testimony today. We have, I'm sure, lots of opportunities to look backwards at the 20 years of our engagement in Afghanistan and its decisions, but I had hoped this committee would rise above the temptations of partisan politics and use this hearing to consider the urgent questions still before us, and I hope we'll get a few minutes to focus on this, Mr. Secretary. How do we get the remaining American citizens, legal permanent residents, and those Afghans who served alongside us or worked with and for us and who are most at risk out of Afghanistan? How do we make sure Afghanistan doesn't become a safe haven for terrorists again and deal with the Taliban? What leverage do we have in doing so? And to also make sure humanitarian aid gets into Afghanistan? And most urgently, how do we support and resettle those Afghan refugees whom we've evacuated to third countries and that much smaller population that has reached the United States? So let me just start with my thanks to the State Department, to the employees in Kabul and Qatar, and the DC-based task force that's worked with the evacuation and repatriation of Americans and Afghans, and to the many Delawareans and Americans whom I've heard from, former military, folks who served in Afghanistan, former diplomats and development professionals eager to help. And I look forward to continuing to coordinate with you and with agencies of our government, advocacy groups, and other partners on resettlement efforts. I'm glad that the former governor of Delaware, Jack Markell, has been asked to step forward and help coordinate this resettlement effort. And I was encouraged today to see Welcome U.S. launch a broad, multi-faith, bipartisan national organization co-chaired by three former presidents, Bush, and Obama, and Clinton, and dozens of faith groups and nonprofits to welcome Afghans to the United States. So let me just start with a question about visa status. Senator Sullivan and I wrote a bipartisan letter in mid-August urging expanded eligibility for the SIV program. I'm interested in how you're working to expand eligibility under the existing visa programs to include family members and to support those the U.S. government supported and worked alongside, but who were not direct employees. I want to start, if I could, Mr. Secretary, by asking you just yes or no questions about three groups that other senators have mentioned.
Sure.
There's about 550 employees and family members from Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who were not evacuated. Is the department prioritizing their evacuation?
Yes.
And the department committed to evacuating our partners from NED, the National Endowment of Democracy, NDI, IRA. Are those also being prioritized?
Yes, they are.
And our partners from the American University of Afghanistan as well?
Yes.
And so if you would take the 4 minutes we've got left and explore with me, how do we ensure safe passage across land borders, whether into Tajikistan or Pakistan, safe and regular flights out of Afghanistan, whether from Mazar-e-Sharif or Kabul, and how do we get documents into the hands of those who don't have identity documents, either because they were destroyed in our embassy or they destroyed them themselves out of fear of the Taliban? And how do we make sure that we're providing the financial support needed for the whole group of refugees who, after thorough vetting, ultimately reach the United States?
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. Those are all very important questions, and let me try to respond briefly to them, and we can take on the details after this session if need be. First, we needed and we have established a clear expectation from the Taliban about allowing people to continue to leave the country, to include American citizens, green card holders, Afghans who are properly documented with a visa, including specifically those who worked in some capacity for the United States. And not only do we have that understanding in public statements by the Taliban, of course, it's built into everything we've done with a large coalition of countries in terms of setting an expectation and making very clear that the failure to fulfill that expectation will have significant consequences, which we can get into. Second, very important to actually make sure that there are ways to travel freely from the country. We made an intensive effort before we left to understand and share with Qatar and Turkey, the countries that stepped up to do this, what was necessary to make sure that the airport in Kabul could continue to function, and ultimately not have charter flights and then commercial flights going in under International Civil Aviation Organization standards. We did intensive work. We brought the American contractors back in the midst of the evacuation, who had been running the airport. To work that, we handed off a very detailed plan, which is now being implemented. Third, the land crossings. We've worked with Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan on this to make sure that as we moved people out of Afghanistan, they would facilitate their crossing into their countries. We would have consular officials surged in the necessary places to handle people coming out in that fashion. And now, to your very important point about documentation, and this is something that maybe we can take offline, we are working on a mechanism and a means by which, and there are multiple ways of doing this, to make sure that people who don't have the necessary document, for example, a visa from us, a physical visa, to get that to them. And I prefer to go into more detail on that in another setting.
Understood. If I might, just as a closing question, you were asked at the outset, sort of what are the factors we weigh as we decide the future of our relationship with the Taliban? And we're in this difficult situation. Many of us recognize the Taliban is a terrorist organization that's done horrific things within Afghanistan in the past, yet we need to have some working relationship with them to secure the safe passage out of thousands of people who we still care deeply about. A number of American citizens with Delaware ties who I've been in contact with didn't leave because their families were still in Afghanistan. And there are clear measures that they should be expected to meet that you laid out in your opening statement. What do you think will be the most important aspects of our leverage to ensure the Taliban perform in ways that we would accept? And what do you think will be the turning point at which we'll make decisions with our allies to take sharper and harsher measures against the Taliban?
So simply put, the nature of the relationship that the Taliban would have with us or most other countries around the world will depend entirely on its conduct and actions, specifically with regard to freedom of travel, as well as to making good on its counterterrorism commitments, upholding basic rights of the Afghan people, not engaging in reprisals, et cetera. These are the things that not only we, but countries around the world are looking at. And there is, I think, significant leverage that we and other countries hold when it comes to things that the Taliban says it wants, but won't get if it does not act in a way that meets these expectations. For example, we talked a little bit before about the existing UN sanctions on the Taliban. These are significant, as well as travel restrictions. There's now a new Security Council resolution that we initiated setting out the expectations for what the Taliban has to do. If it's in violation of that resolution, it's hard to see any of these UN sanctions being lifted, travel restrictions being lifted, and indeed, additional sanctions could well be imposed. Similarly, the foreign reserves of Afghanistan are almost exclusively in banks here in the United States, including the Federal Reserve, other banks, about $9 billion. All of that has been frozen. There are significant resources as well that are in the international financial institutions that Afghanistan normally would have access to. Those too have been frozen. Over the last 20 years or so, the international community has provided about 75% of the Afghan government's annual operating budget. That too has been frozen. So among many things that the Taliban says it seeks, both basic legitimacy and basic support, the United States, the international community, has a hand on a lot of that, much of that, most of that. And so we'll have to see going forward what conclusions the Taliban draws from that and what its conduct will be, matching these basic expectations that we've set.
Thanks. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for taking time to answer our questions today. I'd like to associate myself with the comments that Senator Rubio made about planning for a potential immediate collapse of the Afghan government and security forces. It seemed that as the Taliban was running the table throughout Afghanistan, that the prospect of them continuing to run the table by coming into Kabul was a significant probability that should have been planned for. In your view, Mr. Secretary, has the Taliban abandoned their sympathy and collaboration with groups like Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network? Do they continue to have the same aim, and are they of like spirit, or has that relationship been severed?
The relationship has not been severed, and it's a very open question as to whether their views and the relationship has changed in any kind of definitive way. I think it's fair to say two things. One, whatever the Taliban's views on Al-Qaeda, they do know that the last time they harbored Al-Qaeda and it engaged in an outwardly directed attack, an attack on our homeland, certain things followed, which I believe it would have an interest in not seeing repeated. So whatever their views on Al-Qaeda, there is a strong disincentive built in to allow it to engage in outwardly directed attacks, which the assessment of the intelligence community is they're not currently capable of doing. ISIS-K, the other main group, that's a different thing, as you know, because the Taliban and ISIS-K are sworn enemies. And in fact, over the last 5 or 6 years, since the emergence of ISIS-K, the fight has actually been between the Taliban and ISIS-K, with the Taliban taking most of the territory that ISIS-K sought to hold on to in Afghanistan. The question there, I think, is less whether they have the will to deal with ISIS-K and more whether they have the capacity.
Given that response, I know that previously the position of the administration and the State Department was that the 2001 AUMF no longer played a role of significance. But given the developments in Afghanistan and the Taliban's ongoing collaboration with and sympathy with Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network and like-minded groups, is it not appropriate for the State Department to revisit your recommendation that we abandon the 2001 AUMF?
I think, Senator, we need to look to make sure that we have all the authorities that we would need for any potential contingency, including the reemergence as a threat of Al-Qaeda or the further emergence of ISIS-K as an outwardly directed threat. If we don't have those authorities, we should get them, whether that means relooking at those authorizations or writing new ones, which I think would be the most appropriate thing to do if necessary. We need to look at that.
I appreciate your willingness to change your point of view, in part because the conditions that have developed in the most recent weeks. Nothing wrong with conditions leading to a change in perspective. I for one, thought some years ago that we should withdraw from Afghanistan. The conditions I saw in the ensuing years convinced me that I was wrong. And I, like Senator Shaheen, was one of those that felt that President Trump was wrong to enter into an agreement to withdraw. I thought President Biden was wrong to enter into an agreement or to continue with that agreement to withdraw. And of course, I was appalled by the disastrous withdrawal process itself. For us today, however, I guess I'd like to focus more on the moral stain of leaving people behind. And understand what we can do to make sure that we are not leaving people behind. I understand we're down to a small number of Americans. It's hard to know exactly how many are left behind. But in terms of legal permanent residence, is your priority just as high to get them out as it is to get out citizens? Or is there a different level of commitment for a legal permanent residence return to the United States relative to a citizen?
Senator, our number one priority is American citizens. And that has, I think, long been the case. In this situation in Afghanistan, in this emergency evacuation in Afghanistan, we did everything we could as well to make sure that legal permanent residents, green card holders, would also identify themselves to us. We don't like with American citizens. We don't know at any given time how many there are in any given country around the world, and to make available resources to help them But our number one priority is any remaining American citizens who wish to leave.
I didn't realize there's a secondary level of priority then for a legal permanent resident. If that's the case, how many of them approximately, you said we don't know the exact number, but how many legal permanent residents are we convinced are still in Afghanistan?
We don't have an exact number, but it's in the
but a round number?
In the thousands.
Pardon?
In the thousands.
In the thousands. Likewise, in terms of SIV holders or SIV applicants, or people who've worked with us that have been our partners through the years, how many of them approximately are still in Afghanistan that want to come to the United States?
So this is what we're doing an accounting of right now, based on two things: based on the pipeline of applicants as it existed before the evacuation, and then looking at those who we were able to evacuate. We don't have those numbers yet because, as we've moved to evacuate people, a number of them are still at transit points around the world. Others, as
but it would be tens of thousands.
So, realistically, two things. One, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but of the applicants in the program, and as I said, we inherited about 18,000. About half of those, and this remains more or less the case now, are at a point where it's before the chief of mission has given his or her approval that they are in fact eligible for the program.
I
so
understand.
we focused on the.
I was looking for a number, and I guess the question I was leading to was this, which is, given the fact that the SIV process was so slow and not undertaken during the Trump years in a significant way, you sped it up. That's great. Although you knew that there was no way you were going to get all these people out in time.
Let me put a final point
given the rapid collapse of the Afghan security forces. And you said yesterday that you inherited a date, but in fact you didn't inherit the date. The date was May 1st, and you pushed it to August 31st. Why didn't you push it much later so that we would have been able to process the SIV applicants as well as those who had worked with us that had not yet applied? I don't understand why a date was actually not inherited and a date was not selected that would be sufficient to actually remove people from the nation in a way that would be in keeping with our moral commitment to honor our citizens, our green card holders, as well as those who've worked with us over the years.
Two things, if I may. First, we took some risk in terms of what the Taliban would do or not do after May 1st in pushing beyond May 1st. And we, of course, worked this very hard because
it's a risk with other people we took.
It's a risk.
The risk was on people we care for.
Yeah, just to be clear, if I could, the military told us that in order to do its retrograde, its drawdown from Afghanistan in a safe and orderly way, it needed 3 to 4 months. That's why we pushed to move beyond May 1st and to get to the end of August, early September. Second, to your point, which is an important one and a good one, our expectation was that beyond August 31st, beyond the military drawdown, the government, the security forces, were going to remain in control of Kabul, of the major cities. Our embassy was fully planned to remain up and running. We were leaving about 600 military behind to make sure that we could secure the embassy so that it could continue to operate. We had robust programming planned to include continuing to bring out anyone who wished to leave, notably SIVs. So that was very much the plan and the expectation. What we did not anticipate was that 11-day collapse of the government and security forces. That's what changed everything.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for spending so much time with us. I think what links our failures in Iraq and Afghanistan is that they're both fundamentally failures of hubris, believing that we can control things and influence events on the other side of the world that are beyond our control or influence. America can be a force for good in the world, but there is a limit to what we can achieve. And so there's been decades-long magical thinking with respect to what's in our control and what's outside of our control. As it turns out, it wasn't within our control to be able to stand up an American-style democracy, an American-looking military in Afghanistan that was going to be able to protect the country from the Taliban, but we spent 20 years trying to achieve it. And so, Mr. Secretary, you covered some of this in your opening remarks, but I wanted to ask you a series of questions to try to level set for the committee the situation you inherited, right? What was in your control, what was outside of your control, and then to look at the events of the last 30 to 40 days with that same lens. What was in your control, what was outside of your control. I think these are yes or no answers. Some of it you've covered in your testimony, but I think it's important to get it on the record. So, Mr. Secretary, if President Biden had chosen to breach the agreement that President Trump had signed with the Taliban, would the Taliban have restarted attacks against U.S. troops and bases?
Yes.
As you said in your opening testimony, by the time your administration took office, the Taliban was on the outskirts of several provincial capitals. If President Biden had chosen to breach the agreement between President Trump and the Taliban, would the Taliban have begun offensives on these urban centers?
Yes.
So if the Taliban had begun its siege on these cities and resumed attacks on U.S. troops, would 2,500 troops have been enough to keep the country from falling to the Taliban?
No.
Would double that number have been enough? Do we know how big our force would have had to have gotten?
I think it was the assessment of our military leaders that, not to put a number on it, but significant additional U.S. forces would have been required both to protect ourselves and to prevent the onslaught from the Taliban against the provincial capitals and ultimately against Kabul.
This wasn't a decision between leaving and the status quo. This was a decision between a significant commitment of new U.S. resources to the fight or the continuation of a withdrawal plan.
That's correct.
Okay, let's talk about the last month. So once the Afghan government and the military disintegrate all at once, it seems to me it was pretty predictable and understandable that there would be panic on the ground amongst the Afghan people. So could it be expected that a few thousand U.S. troops and diplomats on the ground at the time would have been able to prevent this panic?
No.
Much has been made about these dramatic and heartbreaking scenes at the airport. Were 2,500 or 5,000 troops enough to stop the Afghan people from rushing to the airport? It created this security nightmare for you, but was there any way for the limited number of personnel that were there to prevent individuals from rushing to the airport?
No, they could control the airport as we did. They could establish a basic immediate perimeter around the airport as we did, but they couldn't control what happened beyond that perimeter.
And so let's talk about that perimeter. Others say, well, we should have controlled a bigger perimeter. We should have taken back over parts of Kabul to secure the passage of Americans and Afghans to the airport. I mean, let's say you had quadrupled the number of troops you had there. Let's say you had 10,000 troops there. Without the Afghan military or a functioning government, would that have been enough to retake Kabul to be able to secure the passage of everyone to the airport?
I don't want to profess to be a military expert, so I'd really defer to my colleagues at the Pentagon on that, but I can say that, I think safely say that it would have taken a substantial number of forces to try to retake the city or establish a much broader perimeter. And of course, if that was ultimately opposed by the Taliban, in a sense, it would have defeated the purpose because anyone outside that perimeter would not have been allowed to get through it, to come to the airport, among other things.
Right, so once the Afghan military collapses, it disintegrates, we don't have enough troops to retake Kabul, and we are in the position of having to rely on the Taliban, or at least communicate with the Taliban, to make sure that we get individuals to the airport.
That's correct.
Okay. I just think this is important to put on the record in a clear and concise way, because we have to have a reckoning in this country about what we can accomplish and what we can't accomplish. It's extraordinary that this administration got 130,000 people out of Afghanistan, given those circumstances, given the situation that they inherited, that you inherited in January of this year. And my worry, Mr. Chairman, is that the malady that we suffered for the last 20 years, this idea that it was just a bad plan, right? It was just a failure of execution as to why we couldn't succeed in Iraq or Afghanistan, is plaguing us again today. That right now we're having a conversation as if we just had a better plan, if we just executed better, we could have avoided these scenes at the airport. We could have guaranteed the easy and safe passage of everyone into that facility. It is heartbreaking what happened. It was impossible for Americans to watch. But if we just simply leave today believing that if we had planned better, if we had better execution, we could have avoided this panic and confusion. I think we're just inviting another Iraq, another Afghanistan in the future. Finally, Mr. Secretary, just quickly expand on your point about the message that sends to China. This idea that the Chinese would love it if we stayed another 10 or 20 years, and why this isn't a sign of weakness. And in fact, this is an ability for you and the national security infrastructure to be able to reorient resources towards fights that we actually can win.
Well, I think Senator, you put it very well. In my assessment and the assessment of many others, as I said, there's nothing that strategic competitors like China, like Russia, or adversaries like Iran and North Korea would like better than for us to have re-upped the war, doubled down on it, and remained bogged down in Afghanistan for another year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, with all of that dedication of resources, all of that energy and focus on that, as opposed to the challenges that we have to face today. And I might add, this committee has done, I think, a very good job on trying to refocus us on, notably the competition from China. So I think that would have been doubling down on this war after 20 years, after nearly $2 trillion, after 2,461 American lives lost, 20,000 injuries, and not to preserve the status quo that existed before May 1st. That would have been one thing. But to be in a situation where the war with us was restarted, the Taliban attacking our forces, attacking our partners and allies, going on an offensive across the country to retake the cities, that would have required a doubling down on a war. And the bottom line is this. We were right to end the war. We were right not to send a third generation of Americans to Afghanistan to fight and die there. And I believe we were right in the extraordinary efforts that were made to make sure we could bring out as many people as possible. And now we have an obligation to make sure that we continue to do that, and of course to guard against the reemergence of any threats coming from Afghanistan.
Senator Porter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the fact you're having this critical hearing today. I must say, I'm going to change what I was going to talk about based on the last interaction. Thank you for being here. I wish General Austin were here because Secretary Austin could answer many of the questions that have just been posed. I have a lot of respect for my colleague, Senator Murphy, as he knows. But this was not a choice between either a dangerous escalation of the war, which has just been laid out, or a precipitous, chaotic withdrawal that embarrassed us around the globe. To say that it was not a sign of weakness the way we left? I mean, I don't know who you're talking to, but if you're talking to our allies in NATO, they will say it was a sign of weakness. If you're talking honestly to our adversaries, they will certainly say it's a sign of weakness, as will terrorist groups around the world. So I hope the lesson we learn here isn't that this was the right way to leave. I hope the lesson we learn here is that there was a better way to leave. If the decision was made to pull out, it should not have been a precipitous, chaotic, and unfortunately deadly departure. This afternoon, I'll be speaking on the floor about Max Soviak. He's a Navy corpsman who was one of the 13 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines who were killed on the wall, trying to help others escape from the tyranny of the Taliban. He should never have been put in that position. It was an impossible position for our troops, for your diplomats, and the impossibility that they faced was due to our policy decisions. There was an alternative. Bagram Air Base, I mean, it was shut down in the middle of the night with no notice to anybody. It was a surprise. I've talked to people who know a lot more about the military side of this than I do, who tell me that, yes, the Afghan troops were a disappointment, but that's partly because they were used to having Americans provide that close air support. And if they'd had that, they could have pushed back against the Taliban. I think you hear that from your military. I think if General Austin were here, we would hear this. But we just left, like just pulled out all the military underpinnings. So without the cover, literally, of close air support and other military support, yeah, it became extremely dangerous and chaotic. And we left a lot of people behind. Senator Romney's asked you to give him some numbers, and you said you're still working on that. Here are the numbers that I have, the best that I have, as the ranking member on the Homeland Security Committee, where we pushed and pushed and pushed. 18,000 applicants for SIV. We got 705 out. You said earlier the overwhelming number of people who were at risk got out. I don't think that's true.
If I could,
No, let me just give you the numbers that I have. We think about 30,000 at-risk Afghans were evacuated out of an estimated 60,000. That's the best numbers we can come up with, because we can't get good numbers from the administration. But that's the best estimate. So that's true, that we left people behind who had stood with us and helped us. Obviously, American citizens are left behind, green card holders are left behind, but thousands of people who stood with us and helped us. And then let's ask about who came. Earlier, there was discussion about what kind of vetting has taken place. The best numbers we have is that about 3/4 of the people who were evacuated were not green card holders, were not American citizens, were not SIV applicants, were not P1 or P2 visa holders. So about 3/4 of these individuals may not have qualified in the sense. Now, you say that they're being vetted. Good, they should be. And, you know, nobody knows, because we can't get good information from the Department of Homeland Security, from the State Department, and others. But, you know, from the start, many of us have said what we do there needs to be based on conditions on the ground. Quite frankly, the president's decision was not based on conditions on the ground. That's why it was a disastrous withdrawal. That's why it put so many people at risk. It should have been an orderly withdrawal under the cover of superior U.S. and NATO military force. We did have 2,500 troops there, but we had 7,500 NATO troops with us too. Again, many of their commanders were shocked at what happened because they were surprised, because there was not good coordination. There was a lack of coordination with the people who had stuck with us. I talked about Bagram. There was also a lack of integrated interagency planning. Of course, we've seen this in terms of how the chaotic withdrawal occurred. These were preventable problems, and they put our military and your diplomats in this impossible situation. They did the best they could, and I commend them for that. In an impossible situation, it's amazing what they were able to perform. But it was so rushed and so chaotic that, again, we didn't get the right people out. And many who we did get out seem not to fall in any of the categories that we were concerned about. So now, what do? Let's look forward, as was suggested by Senator Coons, and I agree with that. You said that you don't believe it will be a platform for terrorism going forward, that the current government, the Taliban government, has said that they will fight back against terrorists. Do you believe that the Haqqani network, and particularly the new Secretary of the Interior, who is a wanted terrorist, based on your administration's assessment, do you believe that that is an indication that they are going to fight back against terrorists?
The question, Senator, from our perspective and our partners' perspective, is whether the Taliban will make good on commitments to ensure that Afghanistan is not used as a place for outwardly directed terrorist attacks. And they've made commitments, but we're not relying on those commitments. We're going to make sure that we have in place the ability to detect any reemergence of that threat and to be able to do something about it if it does reemerge, something that we can talk about in more detail.
Is the Haqqani network considered a terrorist group?
It is.
Is it true that the Interior Minister is a leader of the Haqqani network?
That is accurate.
I just think, sadly, we have shaken the foundations of a lot of our alliances, and we have work to do. And I think we have demonstrated weakness and made the world more dangerous as a result. Let me ask you about one specific question. Well, I guess
the time of the senator has expired.
I will follow up with regard to some of the international financing questions in a letter we sent to Secretary Yellen from Senator Rubio and myself regarding foreign assets.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to turn to the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. The World Food Program observed that half the children under 5 are acutely malnourished in the country, that 14 million individuals in Afghanistan are on the brink of starvation, that 31 of 34 provinces are at risk of losing their health services entirely, and that 1% of the country is vaccinated. This is a fairly accurate description of the challenge for both food and for healthcare?
It is. The humanitarian situation is dire.
Thank you. And the U.S. just participated in an international conference in which $1.1 billion was pledged in humanitarian relief from a variety of nations, including an additional commitment by the United States. But NGOs, non-governmental organizations that often are essential for providing aid, are very concerned about a legal pathway to do so. Because in 2002, the Taliban was listed as a specially designated global terrorist organization under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, and it doesn't have a humanitarian exception. Previously, where we faced this situation in Yemen, the Treasury Department stepped in to create a legal pathway, and a number of senators have written to Secretary Yellen and with copies to you and to Samantha Powers, saying let's use that same pathway here, in which the Office of Foreign Asset Controls issues a general license, creating kind of legal insulation, providing humanitarian assistance. Are you engaged in a conversation about how to create a legal pathway to provide humanitarian assistance?
Yes, we are. We've issued one initial license, as you know. The Treasury issued about 10 days ago. And we're looking at what other authorities might be needed to make sure that humanitarian assistance can flow as best possible in Afghanistan.
Great, thank you. That's absolutely essential. I think we have a significant responsibility. We have the chaos of war in combination with the pandemic and general disruption in the country, and its a moral responsibility to provide assistance. I'm going to ask to enter to the record the letter from September 2nd that the senators and members of the House sent to the administration.
Without objection.
Thank you. So as provincial capitals started to fall, and we had 9 provincial capitals fall in 6 days, there was a lot of discussion about whether the government of Afghanistan would direct a reconsolidation of forces to essentially consolidate protection of the territory it still held, which was a shrinking. Did the government of Afghanistan take key strategic military decisions to consolidate its forces?
It did not, and this was a source of tremendous frustration across the administration, from the president on down, as the summer went on, and we saw the Taliban moving across the country. We repeatedly pressed the Afghan government to do just what you described, which is to consolidate its forces and to defend what was essential to defend and what could be defended, not to extend itself across the entire country, which it didn't have the full capacity to do. Unfortunately, that consolidation and the plan that we urged on them for how to effectively defend the major cities never took shape.
What was the response of the government or from President Ashraf Ghani about why they chose not to consolidate their forces to protect the areas they controlled?
Well, at different moments there were different responses. At some point, I think initially, the response was, "Oh, we can't be seen to be giving up on any part of the country." Never mind that, over the last 5 or 6 years, the amount of the part of the country by population controlled by the government of Afghanistan, if you go back to 2014, 2015, went from about 60% to at the end of last year about 48%. So this was happening to some extent outside the cities, of course, relentlessly, slowly but relentlessly. But then, as we pressed and pressed and pressed on them, the response was, yes, we'll do it, but they didn't.
Well, we have seen over a number of years, we had the challenge of elections that were considered illegitimate by a portion of the country. We had Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani kind of facing off against each other and creating paralysis, great difficulty appointing key ministers to key positions. As we analyze and try to understand the rapid collapse, was there essentially a failure to create an effective decision-making capability within the Afghanistan government?
I think there are a number of factors, and this is something that I hope we all look at going back really over the last 20 years at various key points. Certainly there was a lack of unity in the government because it was comprised of different groups, different factions, and despite, again, very significant efforts to get them to act in a unified way, they couldn't or wouldn't. Second, I think in terms of their effectiveness, there were obviously serious concerns that manifested themselves. And third, one of the endemic problems that we've had over the last 20 years that we've not been able to effectively address is pervasive corruption. And that has so many consequences. One of the consequences, though, is that if you're being asked to fight and put your life on the line for a government or for an institution that's corrupt, that's a pretty hard decision to make. And so I think, as we saw with many Afghan forces, soldiers fighting very, very bravely and giving their lives, but institutionally, the military collapsed in totally unanticipated ways in the course of 11 days. I think as we go back and look, one of the things we have to look at is the impact that this pervasive corruption had in terms of giving the institution the will to fight for the country.
Absolutely. In those final days, as the provincial capitals were falling, President Ghani refused to acknowledge that there were falling capitals. It was almost like a world in which he was disengaged. And then the finance minister resigned and said he was leaving the country for family reasons, but it was taken as a symbol of the government on the verge of collapse. And then shortly thereafter, President Ghani fled himself. I think it was August 15th, Sunday, August 15th. And did we have forewarning of this beginning of the cabinet to essentially flee the country, and how did we respond to that?
We did not. On Saturday, as it happens, I spoke to President Ghani. We were working on a plan to have a transfer of power to a Taliban-led but more broadly representative government to include many of the different actors in Afghanistan, working on that in Doha. I was calling President Ghani to make sure that he would support that. That was critical. He told me he would, but he said if the Taliban wouldn't go ahead with it, he would, and I'm paraphrasing here, fight to the death. That was Saturday. He left Afghanistan the next day on Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you. For the awareness of senators, there is a vote going on. There's a subsequent vote going on as well. It's my intention to try to continue through the process, but I just want to make members aware. Senator Paul.
I've advocated for an end to the Afghan war for over a decade. I'm glad it's finally over. But never in my worst nightmares could I have imagined that an administration would leave $80 billion worth of weaponry to the Taliban. Dozens of planes and helicopters, thousands of armored carriers, hundreds of thousands of automatic weapons, and worst of all, 13 of our brave young men and women. Never in my worst nightmares did anyone or conceive of such a colossal incompetence. Abandoning Bagram Air Force Base will be remembered as one of the worst military decisions in our history. Holding no one accountable, having everyone circle the wagons and say, hey, we all agreed abandoning Bagram Air Force Base was a great idea. This is going to be remembered by the people. Holding no one accountable for letting the base go, it will be remembered. To add insult to injury, this week you've now released $64 million in aid to Afghanistan. Don't we have some prohibition against giving aid and comfort to the enemy? Now, the argument from the Biden administration is, oh, we're giving it to charities and it's for the good of the people, for poor people and for women. Well, the Taliban has a history of taking this. Throughout their governance, they would take the money. This was a big complaint we had when they were in power the last time. They now have $80 billion worth of weapons, 350,000 automatic weapons. Are we really naive enough to believe that we're just going to keep sending charity to Afghanistan and they're not going to interrupt it? I think that's a foolish notion. The $64 million, though, is the tip of the iceberg. There's still about $10 billion out there that was designated for the Afghan government. Can you pledge today, without equivocation, that the Biden administration will not release any of this money to the Taliban?
Absent the Taliban making good on the commitments and expectations of the international community that I've outlined previously, that's correct.
Maybe we could deduct a fee for the weapons they took.
So, Senator, on the weapons, again, I'll defer to my colleagues at the Pentagon who are more expert in this. You're right that about $80 billion worth of weaponry has been provided over the course of the last 15 or 16 years. Much of that, the significant weaponry, planes, helicopters, is actually inoperable, will soon become inoperable because it can't be maintained. In terms of the strategic threat that weaponry poses, it doesn't to us or to Afghanistan's neighbors.
But you can't say you're not going to give them the money. If they behave, you're going to give them the money. Why don't we subtract the $80 billion from the $10 billion you're going to give them? Then they're minus 70 still. I mean, really, the fact that you're entertaining good behavior, that they'll get more money, I think is a big mistake and a naive notion that we're going to somehow change this Stone Age philosophy by giving them more of our money. We've sunk trillions of dollars over this. This is our chance to have a peace dividend. Let's quit sending good money after bad. The guy the Biden administration droned, was he an aid worker or an ISIS-K operative?
The administration is, of course, reviewing that strike, and I'm sure that a full assessment will be forthcoming.
So you don't know if it was an aid worker or an ISIS-K operative?
I can't speak to that, and I can't speak to that in this setting in any event.
So you don't know or won't tell us?
I don't know because we're reviewing it.
Well, see, you'd think you'd kind of know before you off somebody with a Predator drone, whether he's an aid worker or he's an ISIS-K. See, the thing is this isn't just you. It's been going on for administration after administration. The Obama administration droned hundreds and hundreds of people. And the thing is there is blowback to that. I mean, I don't know if it's true, but I see these pictures of these beautiful children that were killed in the attack. If that's true, and not propaganda, if that's true, guess what? Maybe you created hundreds or thousands of new potential terrorists from bombing the wrong people. So you got to know we can't sort of have an investigation after we kill people. We have an investigation before we kill people. We've got plenty of bombs. We can bomb almost anything we want from anywhere in the world. Maybe we should have bombed the helicopters and the planes that we left behind. I mean, even though you said you didn't know any of this and was all surprised, once they took all of our stuff, we should have said you got 20 minutes to get out of it because we're going to blow it all up. Then you would have sent a message of strength. Instead, we bombed somebody who we're not sure whether it was an aid worker or an ISIS-K operative. See, that's not sending a signal of strength. And in the end, there will be more blowback from it. If you killed an aid worker on accident, I mean, do you think we're better off because of that? You really could have acted in a position of strength, but you could have made the basic decision, the basic fundamental decision that really ruined the whole thing for you was a military decision to abandon Bagram Air Force Base before you left, before the Americans were out. Anybody can argue, and you may have a point, that it happened more quickly than we thought it was going to happen. Okay, that's an honest mistake, still a huge mistake. And when people make mistakes in the military, they ought to be relieved of their post. But leaving Bagram Air Force Base, I think, is an unforgivable sort of mistake. It's going to be remembered in history. But if you do nothing about it, you leave all these people in place and say, oh, well, we all agreed. It's like, then maybe everybody needs to go. I mean, but really, it was a terrible mistake. But releasing money to the Taliban will add insult to injury. It'll be terrible for the memory of the 13 soldiers who died in the end, who were the final soldiers to die in this war, if you end up giving money to the people that have been ruining the Middle East and Afghanistan for decades. I hope you won't release the money, and I think it'll be a big mistake.
Thank you. I understand Senator Schatz is with us virtually.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
And before Senator Schatz begins, I'm going to ask Senator Kaine to preside so I can vote and come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Blinken, thank you for appearing before the committee. I want to sort of zoom out a little bit. The defense establishment, political appointees, so-called think tank experts, defense contractors are complaining loudly about tactics because it's their strategy that failed. They're complaining about how America's longest war ended because they didn't want it to ever end. And they're mad because they think we should be an occupying force indefinitely. And they know that position is untenable. So they dive into tactics. They want to talk about holding on to Bagram for longer or sending forces into Kabul. They won't acknowledge the fundamental mistake was that we invaded a country in Central Asia without a good understanding of its people, its history, or of its culture. After 20 years, trillions of dollars spent and training of hundreds of thousands of Afghan security forces, the Afghan government we installed was no more capable of being the referee in a civil war than before we invaded. That's not the fault of our service members or diplomats. It's the fault of policymakers who set unrealistic goals. And so the basic question I have for you, Mr. Secretary, is what are the lessons of the last 20 years of war?
Well, Senator, I think you actually summed it up extremely well. And I would say two things, just to put a fine point on it. We went to Afghanistan for one reason, and that was to deal with the people who attacked us on 9/11, to bring them to justice, and to the best of our ability, make sure that that would not happen again from Afghanistan. And we largely succeeded in that effort a long time ago, with bin Laden being killed in 2011, and Al-Qaeda, in terms of its capacity to conduct attacks on the homeland from Afghanistan, vastly degraded to the point where it is currently assessed that it does not have that capacity. Somewhere along the way, with the best of intentions, we also sought to remake the country and, in effect, to use military force to remake another society. And I think to your point, and the point that Senator Murphy and others have made, whatever our intentions, that is probably something that is beyond our capacity. And the net of that is that we were there for 20 years. We lost 2,461 Americans. 20,000 were injured, excuse me. About $2 trillion were spent in direct and indirect costs. That's the equivalent of about $300 million every single day for 20 years, on average. And to those who say, well, yes, but you'd arrived in a place where the expenditures in terms of people and resources were sustainable, well, that's simply not the reality that we faced. Because, as we've discussed, given the deadline established for the removal of U.S. forces by the previous administration, the choice we had was either to go through with that and withdraw our forces, or to re-up the war, to escalate, to send in more forces, more loss of life, more loss of resources, indefinitely. And to what end? To what result? In terms of having something sustainable in a government or in security forces that could protect the country and uphold basic rights. So I think those lessons are important, they're profound, and I hope all of us together will reflect on those and other lessons that we've learned, both in what we've done tactically, including in this administration, as well as what we've done strategically across many administrations over 20 years.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I am worried about reports that we're seeing about acts of violence against journalists, women and girls, and the Taliban targeting minority groups like the Hazara people, groups who have a brutal history of committing violence against them are probably going to get worse. So what are we doing to ensure physical access for the NGOs that service these constituencies?
Thank you, Senator. These reports, which I've also seen, whether in media reporting and in videos and other reports, are deeply disturbing. And I think whether it's us or whether it is many other countries around the world that we've been working to organize and to focus. This, of course, violates the basic expectations that we have of a Taliban-led government in terms of its need to not abuse these rights, but to uphold them. So we are working to make sure that we are all both speaking with one voice and acting together when it comes to using the influence and leverage we have with the Taliban to insist that it meet these expectations. Second, when it comes to humanitarian assistance and other kinds of support, besides providing that support to NGOs, to the United Nations and its agencies, we are doing whatever we can to help ensure that those agencies and those NGOs are able to operate, pressing directly and indirectly on the Taliban-led government to ensure their ability to do that and their protection. But this is very much a moving picture and something we're very focused on right now and in the days and weeks ahead.
Well, one final question. I understand this is not the main thing. I understand there are people who remain in mortal danger, but from your standpoint, the Department of State, you've got to be a little worried about morale for those people who have dedicated the better part of 20 years to this effort. And so what can we do? Not what can we say, but what can we do on behalf of the Foreign Service, especially at a time when we need to be building back our diplomatic corps?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, Senator, because you're exactly right, and it's very, very important to me, and it's very, very important institutionally. I've spent time with all of our returning diplomats from Afghanistan, either personally or virtually, depending on where they were, and spent a lot of time listening to them, hearing them, and trying to address the concerns that they have. And to your point, we have so many people who've invested their work, their careers, their lives in Afghanistan, developed relationships, a deep love for the country, and this is very challenging, painful for many of them. And of course, those who participated in the evacuation itself, who were literally at the gates at the Kabul airport, side by side with these extraordinary men and women in uniform doing that work, including the 13 who lost their lives, who were killed in the terrorist attack. I had officers who were literally serving next to them up to a couple of hours before that attack, knew them by first name. And so the impact, both over 20 years and more immediately, with our people who were there literally pulling people in to safety, helping to talk people in, to walk people in, officers around the department who stood up and volunteered to help in some way, and many of them who ran into HKIA to the airport to help get people out. So we're spending time talking to them, listening to them, and also providing them the support that some of them may need, including
Mr. Secretary, if I could ask you to
support.
sum up, we're over time, and there's still
sorry.
8 senators who want to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Barrasso. Thank you, Senator Schatz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, President Biden has described the evacuation from Afghanistan as an extraordinary success. His words, extraordinary success. This has to be the lie of the 21st century. It's dishonest, and if he believes it, it's delusional. America can no longer ever say we leave no American behind, because Joe Biden did. And by your own testimony and your words this morning, there are still about 100 Americans trapped behind enemy lines. We've heard a lot about the 13 U.S. service members who died a couple of weeks ago. One was Riley McCullum of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. He was 20 years old, signed up for the Marines on his 18th birthday. His wife Gigi, expecting a baby. The baby was delivered just yesterday, a baby girl. I stood with Riley's family and his then pregnant wife on Friday in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, as his remains were brought back in a flag-draped coffin from Afghanistan. Never made it back home alive as a result of this administration's failures. People of Wyoming view this as having lost one of their sons, one of their children. It is a devastating loss. And they really do believe that it is the administration who should hold the blame for what has occurred. Look, this withdrawal, and you've heard it from other senators on both sides of the aisle, has been an epic failure. No planning, no strategy. No, it was cobbled together at the last minute, disorganized. It didn't have to be this way. I'm thinking back to your confirmation hearing. I raised a number of questions and concerns about your record on foreign policy failures in Syria, in Libya, in Iran. I said these botched decisions have serious consequences. I said I believe they embolden terrorist organizations around the globe. I said your decisions in the past have put lives of men and women who serve our nation at risk because of these failures. And I said I think it would be a grave mistake to confirm a Secretary of State who has a demonstrated track record of repeatedly making the wrong decisions when it comes to American foreign policy and national security. And the actions I've seen from you over the last 7 months have proven my assessment to be correct. The Biden administration's missteps are numerous. Failed to start evacuation operations until the fall of Kabul in August, despite announcing the withdrawal in April. Failed to heed the warnings of a collapse of the Afghan government and security forces in spite of warnings. Failed to prepare for a rapid Taliban takeover. Failed to adapt the politically motivated deadline for withdrawal to the situation taking place on the ground because they were so focused on the calendar on the wall. Failed to keep Bagram Air Force Base, a place I've visited about 8 or 9 times, the U.S. military base, 2 runways that could be used to help evacuate civilians. And we just heard failure to prevent a vast arsenal of weapons from getting into the hands of the Taliban. I mean, it seems the most egregious, though, that I hear about in Wyoming and people all across the country are most offended by is abandoning American citizens as well as abandoning our allies in Afghanistan. Senator Portman went over the numbers. The Washington Post called it a moral disaster. I think it's a moral disgrace. You nearly dislocated your shoulder, though, patting yourself on the back for the great job you've done. I mean, just yesterday, you stated, we did the right thing by our citizens in working feverishly to get every one of them out. But you didn't get every one of them out. You've admitted again and again we're talking about over 100 Americans. The top priority must always be getting all Americans home safely. And now with no U.S. personnel in Afghanistan, the Americans that President Biden left behind, instead of going on national TV and saying, we will not take the troops out until every American is out, their options for escaping are dwindling. So I'm trying to put this all together to say, how did we end up here? In April, the president made a decision to announce everyone would be out by August 31st. May 8th, there was a rehearsal of concept, which is a dress rehearsal for withdrawal. I know that the National Security Council was there, the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Homeland Security, they were all there. My understanding is that you did not attend. Is that true?
My deputy responsible for the operation was there.
I know where you were. I think you should have been here instead. I understand in late June, the State Department was getting nervous because the military drawdown was moving on schedule, but not the civilian drawdown. You were running behind. I understand State Department was talking to the Defense Department to slow down the pace of military withdrawal, calling actually for, quote, tapping the brakes on military withdrawal. Isn't that true?
Senator, I'm not going to get into any internal deliberations or discussions that we had. We worked on this together every step of the way.
In July, you got more warnings, State Department, things were getting bad. When did the State Department formally make the request to the Department of Defense for military-assisted evacuation, the non-combatant evacuation operation? Because that's a secretary or ambassador job.
The NEO was being planned, if necessary, throughout the spring and summer. We revised the plans on a number of occasions. And ultimately, when the government and security forces unexpectedly collapsed in the 11 days, the NEO went into effect.
So middle of August?
That's correct.
And why did you wait so long?
Because we had a government and security forces in place that by every estimate would be able to protect the city, protect Kabul, protect the other provincial capitals, certainly through the year.
So yesterday you testified that the Taliban has been designated a terrorist organization. I want to be very clear on this, because that's what you said yesterday. Quote, the Taliban has been designated a terrorist organization. Does this administration believe the Taliban is a terrorist organization?
It's designated under one of the designations, and any engagement that we have will be purely for the purposes of advancing our interests.
Under one of the designations.
Yes,
when does this administration
designated
plan to list the Taliban as U.S. designated foreign
Specially
terrorist
designated terrorist organization, that's correct.
And you testified this morning about the SIV washout rate. I think it's about 40% that they don't
Before the
qualify.
Chief of Mission approval, that's correct.
So what percentage of the Afghan population that left Afghanistan as part of our U.S. evacuation efforts, what percentage of those were vetted before they actually got on the airplanes?
Before they got on the airplanes to leave Kabul? Certainly not. Most of them were not. That's exactly why we established transit points in countries through negotiations with those countries to make sure that before anyone came to the United States, they would be vetted by the different law enforcement and security agencies. So we established agreements with well more than a dozen countries.
So who were you letting on the planes? Anybody that showed up?
Well, initially, as you know, there were people who managed to flood the airport. We had to do an immediate assessment of those. We had to make sure we could clear people out of the airport so that the flights could come in, go out. But no one came to the United States without being checked somewhere else first to make sure that they don't pose a security threat.
My time's expired. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would just have to say I spent time overseas last week talking to our NATO allies at a security conference as well as with NATO individuals, and I'll tell you, our enemies are emboldened and our allies are enraged.
Senator Booker.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here, and thank you for allotting so much time and taking every single question posed to you. I want to first maybe just pick up with what my friend and colleague asked. Could you characterize the Americans that are still there? I know there are a lot of them that didn't necessarily want to come back. There were just a whole array of different reasons. Could you give us a better understanding of those that have remained and what their circumstances are?
Certainly. Senators, we've noted, starting back in March, we issued 19 separate messages to any American citizen who was registered with the embassy, urging them to leave Afghanistan, to avail themselves of commercial flights that were running, offering assistance if they needed it, because we knew it was a very volatile security environment. And especially when we started the ordered departure of our embassy on April 27th, it's also very incumbent upon us to make sure that we are making clear to any American citizens that they should take the opportunity to leave. By the time of the evacuation, despite these 19 separate messages, there were still somewhere around 5,000 or 6,000 American citizens left in Afghanistan. And as we've noted earlier, we never know whether it's Afghanistan or any other country around the world at any given moment how many American citizens are there, because no one is required. When you travel abroad, when you reside abroad, you're not required to register with the embassy or with anyone else. Many people do, many don't. But we made a massive effort to try to determine how many people were there. So the reason, to get to your point, the reason that despite all of these warnings, despite the environment, people remained, is because for virtually all of them, Afghanistan was their home. They'd lived there for years, for decades, for generations. Their extended family was there. And it is the most wrenching of all decisions to have to decide whether or not to leave the place you know as home.
I wanted to give more texture to this complex situation. This is not that there were people there. There are many people that fall into the category of not being abandoned by our country, but have made the conscious choice to stay in country, correct?
That's correct.
You have been, I've only been here 8 years, but I will say to you and your staff, you have been the most responsive State Department team that my office has dealt with. We have brought many, as you know, people to your attention, both American citizens and Afghanis who wanted to get out, have worked with us to many different degrees of success, and I'm grateful for that. I have now witnessed with my senior senator, we went to our joint base and saw the facilities being done for those who have met extreme vetting and have made it to the United States. What is going on with the 13,000 expected in New Jersey and the 65 to 70,000 is America at its best. I met from military personnel, the State Department personnel, talking to me about this being some of the proudest work they've ever done. And I think Americans should be aware of that and what's going on. We are a great nation, and this is a reflection of those words on the Statue of Liberty. I want to pick up, though, on the situation as it is. I think it was Senator Merkley who brought up the concerns about humanitarian interest, a humanitarian crisis that is really boiling over there. And I want to just get you to reiterate that you issued one license, but we really need more, correct?
Yeah, I understand that, and that's exactly what we're looking at. We want to make sure that all the authorities exist to provide that humanitarian assistance, including by not just our own NGOs, but others as well.
And it's a strategic situation where we know we control significant resources the Afghan government has been relying on to run basic services. This is a strategic leverage that we have over the Taliban to continue to try to pressure them into honoring human rights, honoring the rights of women, countering some of the terrorist concerns that we have, and it's very important. However, given what we understand, without those resources, there are going to be continued humanitarian suffering. As the New York Times reported, the World Food Program is estimating about 40% of Afghans' crops are going to be lost. There's going to be tremendous.
I understand you've been there for almost 3 hours now. I appreciate your persistence in this. Mr. Secretary, my staff has been working very closely with yours on the issue of Afghan special immigration applications, or SIVs, some of which have been initiated for over 3 years. As you are aware, I sent a letter to you last week that outlines my concerns, and I spoke to Deputy Secretary McEwen 3 weeks ago. Due to the preparation for the hearing, I received updates on 3 of the 5 SIV cases my staff has been working for months on. I sincerely appreciate the efforts of your staff to get me this information, which I provided last night to the South Dakota veterans who requested my help. And for that, I want to thank you. I would, however, like you to be aware of my concern pertaining to a key reason that has hamstrung my efforts to assist SIV applicants. This is the department's position, stated to my staff on multiple occasions, that it is precluded by law from providing updates or noting any potential defects in applications. Mr. Secretary, if true, this would prevent members of Congress from executing oversight and constituent service responsibilities, specifically when they're advocating in support of an applicant. It would also, incidentally, violate the department's own Foreign Affairs manual.